Hi everyone, my name is Annika Redgate and I will be presenting my final project, which is focused on the Supreme Court case June Medical Services LLC v. Russo and the impact of Amicus Curiae briefs on Supreme Court opinions in abortion rights cases. So what is an Amicus Curiae brief? Amicus Curiae means friend of the court, and these types of briefs are a way for organizations that are not a party in a case but are interested in the issue of the case to participate in the argument of the case. What is the role that these types of briefs have in the Supreme Court? They act as the primary method of interest group involvement in the U.S. courts. The goal is to pursue the organization's own policy goals by using these briefs to give the court information not addressed by parties of the case in order to present legal arguments and the policy implications of the decision that the court has to make. What are the types of arguments that Amicus Curiae briefs present? They present legal, social, political, and moral arguments. What are the models for judging that could create different implications for amicus briefs? There are three: the legal model, the attitudinal model, and the interest group model. My research question is in two parts. The first part is, did the amicus briefs who had briefs used in the majority opinion, which was written by the liberal Justice Breyer, provide legal argument-based guidance? Part B, did amicus groups who had briefs used in the main dissenting opinion, which was written by conservative Justice Alito and was joined by the other conservative justices, provide moral argument-based guidance? My research question was influenced by several scholars, including Joseph D. Kearney and Thomas W. Merrill, the authors of Influence of Amicus Briefs on the Supreme Court, and Ryan J. Owens and Lee Epstein, the authors of Amicus Curiae during the Rehnquist years. Kearney and Merrill explained that the legal model and attitudinal model are models of judging that have different implications based on amicus briefs. The legal model is when justices resolve cases in accordance to their understanding of relevant sources of law. The attitudinal model is when justices resolve cases in accordance with their political beliefs. Owen and Epstein established that abortion is a privacy-based matter and explained that the majority opinion of the court has the highest percent of citing an amicus brief when it comes to cases involving privacy and civil rights. Additionally, they address the fact that the liberal wing of the court references briefs more often than the conservative wing, at a rate of 46% to 32%. I have two hypotheses, and they are as follows. I expect that the majority opinion written by a liberal justice will include more amicus briefs in comparison to the main dissenting opinion, and the arguments in these briefs will be legal arguments. I expect that the main dissenting opinion written by a conservative justice will include less amicus briefs in comparison to the majority opinion, and the arguments in these briefs will be moral arguments. Based on the fact that this case is focused on abortion access, it is reasonable to assume that the liberal wing of the Supreme Court would vote to support ease of abortion access, as they tend to be more pro-choice, and the conservative wing of the Supreme Court would vote against ease of abortion access, as they tend to be more pro-life. These hypotheses were derived from the scholars mentioned before, and I want to put their theories to the test. The case that I focused on was June Medical Services LLC v. Russo. This case began in June 2014 when Louisiana passed Act 620, which required that every physician who performed abortions have active admitting privileges at a hospital located no more than 30 miles from the location where the physician performs abortions. Now, while challenges to Act 620 were pending in the courts, the Supreme Court struck down a law that was almost identical to Act 620 in Texas in the case Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt. The Louisiana District Court declared Act 620 to be invalid as it had no relevant credentialing function, as physicians get denied admitting privileges at hospitals for reasons other than competency, and drastically burdened women's access to abortion. The U.S. Appeals Court for the Fifth Circuit reviewed the case from the beginning and determined that the case was remarkably different from the one in Texas, and decided that since no abortion clinic would close due to the act, there was no undue burden being placed. The question that the court addressed was, does the decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which upholds Louisiana's Act 620, conflict with the precedent set by the Supreme Court in Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt? The ruling, which was decided on June 29, 2020 in a 5-4 decision, reversed the decision of the Fifth Circuit and ruled that Louisiana's Act on 620 was unconstitutional. In this case, there were around 80 amicus briefs submitted. My research steps are as follows. I obtained case and amicus brief information from sources such as SCOTUS blog and supremecourt.gov. I reviewed the majority and main dissenting opinion with the most justices joining, and identified the amicus briefs, if any, that were mentioned. I reviewed all the amicus briefs mentioned in the opinions of the Supreme Court for language that relates to legal or moral arguments. For each type of argument, I picked 6 words that fell in line with these ideologies. For legal, I picked precedent, undue, burden or burdensome, choice, access, and stare decisis. For moral arguments, I picked unborn, life, victim, fail, failed or failure, competence or incompetence, insufficient or insufficient. My method of review is to copy and paste each amicus brief into a Google Drive document and use Google Drive's find feature for relevant words, and then count the number of times the words were mentioned and record that number. Additionally, I will read through each amicus brief in detail and explain the overall argument of each. Now, here is all of the amicus briefs mentioned in Justice Breyer's majority opinion. As you can see, the first brief had an overall total of legal argument language at 8 words, and the second had 27 words. I determined that both the brief by the medical staff professionals and the brief by American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists contain mostly legal arguments overall. The evidence for that is shown through their arguments listed on this slide. Now, Justice Alito referenced 5 amicus briefs in his dissenting opinion. And as you can see, the first brief included 66 moral argument language words. The second contained 112 words. The third contained 38 words. The fourth contained 51 words. And the fifth contained 16 words. I determined that the brief by the 207 members of Congress, the brief by the Louisiana state legislators, and the brief by the state of Arkansas, Indiana et al. Contain mostly legal arguments overall. The evidence for that is shown through their arguments listed on this slide. I determined that the brief by the 2,624 women injured by abortion et al. And the brief by the Priests for Life et al. Contain mostly moral arguments overall. The evidence for that is shown through their arguments listed on this slide. My conclusions relating to my hypotheses are as follows. For hypothesis 1, I was incorrect, as liberal Justice Breyer used less amicus briefs in comparison to conservative Justice Alito. In regard to my word count method, this did not provide enough information as determining to include legal argument language, as the numbers were too low for the first brief and higher for the second. My brief analysis method, though, did provide enough information to declare that the legal arguments were made. For my second hypothesis, I was incorrect, as Justice Alito used more amicus briefs. For the word count method, it did provide enough information as the numbers were relatively high for all of the amicus briefs except for the last brief at only 16. And for my brief analysis method, I did not prove my hypothesis, as 3 out of the 5 briefs used mainly legal arguments. These briefs were by government entities, and the 2 briefs that used moral arguments were more pro-life based. Overall, my findings are consistent with the literature, as the data I collected gives an unclear conclusion as to what kinds of arguments will be used in what sort of amicus briefs and how briefs will be used by liberal and conservative justices respectively. Thank you all for listening. Here are my sources.